They asked me to speak about our Slovenian version of this massive migration after World War II in Istria, and here I speak about my book that it was published some months ago, and the title is "In the Silence of Memory: Exodus in Istria." So Istria, as we know, also with Croatian partners, it's a contested land. In 20th century, 5 states, under 5 states, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italian Kingdom, that was with the fascist regime. And in this time, because of this violent fascism, there were migrations. Circa 105,000 Slovenes and Croatians from the region of Venetia Giulia migrated, and that is, Istria would present 1/3 of the territory. Then after the World War II, this multicultural land became a free territory of Trieste, divided in 2 zones, zoned as a contested land between Italian and Yugoslavian demands. Here is the zone A around Trieste, that in 1954 then was annexed to Italy, and our part, with part of Croatian Istria, was part of Zone B, that later became part of Yugoslavia in 1954. And Istrian exodus happened in this time of this unsure situation till the annexation of these territories to Italy and Yugoslavia some years after. So of the 90% of Italians before World War II, in 1957, only 10% of them remained in the Istrian towns in Slovenia, and they were protected as a national minority in 1954. But from the whole Istria migrated, there are different numbers, but between 200,000 and 300 people, predominantly Italians and some Slovenians and Croatians. In this Slovenian part that I did the ethnological research is 28,000, and among them 70% of Italians and 30% of Slovenian and Croatians. In this time we had also the contra-exodus. This is a really small number of mostly workers of socialist background. They say between 2,000 and 10,000 Italians who came to Istria, to Yugoslavia, to build the socialism. So these emptied spaces were resettled by immigrants from inner Slovenia and Yugoslavia, what meant a complete transformation of ethnic, social, and cultural face of Istria. So in 1960, there were only 49% of native residents in Istria, a larger number in rural areas, and only 33% in urban areas, because there were mostly Italians. Mostly Italians were living in the urban areas. They were living also in the rural, but concentration was in the urban areas. So the consequence of this exodus, as it's called by Italians, is the ethnic homogenization of contested lands on Yugoslavian side and also on the Italian side, because the multicultural region around the border with the Slovenian minority, these Italian migrants were settled down, and also in other multicultural areas. So theoretically, there are 2 interpretive frameworks. According to Philip Ter, this exodus can be interpreted in the so-called population transfers that happened after World War II under Allies politics, willing to prevent further ethnical conflicts, while Bellinger questions this thematic theoretical frame, saying that this exodus could be interpreted also in post-imperial frame, because with the defeat of fascism, Italy lost newly acquired African and Balkan territories. So also Istria, so it can be both, let's say. So concerning exodus, we have conflicting national memories. As you see on the book, I'm consciously using the word exodus. In Slovenia, mostly never researchers call this exodus, but the Slovenian and Croatian researchers call this mass migrations, migrations. While the Italians call them exodus, seeing more on a mononational process of migrations. The migrants are called esuli, what it means refugees, while the Slovenian and Croatian researchers till now argumented about the free will, and the migrants are called optanti, because their decision to migrate was based on the two peace treaties in 47 and 54, where they gave the legal right to opt for Italian citizenship. And if they gave this request, they had the obligation to move to Italy in 1 year. There are also different so esuli feel as victims of Slavic and communism barbarism, while the Slovenian feel as victims of Italian imperialism and of decades of violent fascism and the World War II crimes. So on both sides, there is a strong victimization. When we count these migrants according to ethnicity, many researchers argue this is very problematic, because to opt in this multicultural environment, with most people being bilingual, meant also to declare a nationality for the sake of convenience. Because also in Italy, the refugee help was meant for the Italian migrants. And here we are faced with the changeability of ethnic identities through the past as strategies for survival and of adapting a higher social status. Like, it was more convenient to be Italian during the fascism, and it was later more convenient to declare yourself Yugoslavian and not Italian during the time of Yugoslavia. Here I have, always in this kind, I have some memories, the pieces of memories that from the book. So somebody said from Croatia, Istrians paid no attention to national affiliation and did not opt to live on national grounds alone. It wasn't only the Italians who opted. There were also Croatian, Istrians, and others, regardless of their nationality. Many members of my family left. My family, also Croatian, considered themselves Istrian and were never driven by a sense of nationality. So here we have a really hybrid, fluent identities and a strong regional identity, as we saw. And here also is a memory of one Slovenian, Istrian, who said, before we didn't call ourselves Slovenians. If you are born in Italy, you are Italian. If you are born in Austria, but here we were Istrians. But the people from Piran, they called everyone outside Piran Ščavi, slaves. They considered them to belong to some other nation, not theirs. They treated us like peasants. So here we have a social class conflict between urban and peasant population that is transformed to ethnic conflict. And in the stereotype, it was always urban, Italian, meant civilized, against the rural, barbaric, and Slav. So here, the problem is also the 20 years of fascism, which interrupted the reinforcement of the Slavic ethnicity in the urban settings because of this violent Italianization of Slovenians and Croats. But these two decades of fascist forced Italianization and violence and war crimes, the consequence of it was a mutual enmity of Italians and Slovenes. And so it consolidated also the Slovene and Italian identities that were then strengthened. So ethnic identity proves to be strongest in borderlands and becomes crucial when under threat. So as somebody said, an Italian, there was a lot of hostility that Italian or the Italians look at this chavo. It means slaves. Concerning Exodus, I did the ethnological research in Istria with the present day inhabitants. So with the Italians, Slovenians, Croats, and all the people who migrated here. And there is a big silence. That's why my book has the title In the Silence of Memory. So as already Halbach said, when individual memories do not correspond to the collective image of the past, they are excluded from collective memory or they're censored. And here, the biggest, the most strong silence was among the Italians living in Istria. Why? The first thing is that their memories of the Exodus, they are incompatible with either the Slovenian memory, either with the Italian. Because in the Slovenian memory, the Exodus is perceived as voluntary migrations, as a consequence of defeat of fascism. While in the Italian memory, the conflict with the Italian memory is that the remained Italians are aware of the causal link with fascist violence, which Italian national discourse overlooks. Because usually, also the Italian national discourse, when speaking about Exodus and the Italian victimization, the history starts in 43 with the Foibe and later with Exodus. But usually the 20 years of fascism is omitted. While the Italians who remained here, they're very well aware of this link. As an Italian said me, shifting things now about Exodus is like placing a mine and not knowing when it will explode. And another Italian said, better be quiet, there are plenty of fears everywhere. So, speaking about Exodus was a taboo in Istria, especially among the Italians. The tabooization started with the democratization in the 90s, and there were not researchers starting with the word about this, speaking about this, but it was the writers, the novelists. But still, this silence is very persistent, and I had very great difficulties to get, especially Italians, people who would speak about this time. They just rejected. Mostly, they rejected to make the interviews with me. So after Exodus, as you will see later, Italians became others in the society, marginalized, although they were protected as a national minority. And here we have also the dichotomy between winners and losers, because Italians here as fascists, perceived as fascists, although the Warsaw state were not fascist, in the Slovenian perception or in the perception of the winners, the losers do not have the right for mourning. So they are constrained to silence. And here is an Italian memory. I remember wondering at home as a child in 55, how there were 43 of us in the class during the first year. And every day someone went missing. I would return home and ask, Mom, Vinicio, Lucio, Maria are all gone. Where did they go? Ah, they will come back, you will see, she would reply. I was young, we lived in isolation, but I tell you, I only discovered the Exodus when I read the books of Tomica on the University of Belgrade. Nobody talked about that. The other reason for this big silence is when the memory hurts, we can say. When the Exodus was happening, these people were mostly children, and they lost everything. They lost, as here is a memory of one Italian. She said, my memory at that time with Exodus has halved in two parts and has never merged again. It's a wound that has never healed. And then in tears, she told me that. Also, the interview I made with her, it was very interesting, a very difficult interview for an ethnologist, because there was no, let's say, free talking, but she was so afraid of giving me the interview that she wrote 1 week before the interview everything in the notebook. So for 1 hour and a half, the interview seemed like that she was reading what she has prepared to tell me. When I asked her, at the end, she told me this and she broke in tears. And then she said, I wrote everything down because I didn't want to cry in front of you. And it's clear here that she was giving me the memories of her was in a kind of scientific way, what in Pula, in Croatia happened, what happened with the allies, with the Italian army. And it was her personal memories mixed with the kind of history. And in this interview, it can be clearly seen that she's trying to discipline the memory, to present them in a scientific way. Also, some other anthropologists noted that, like the one who were researching the Pied Noir of the Algerian War, French-Algerian War. And as Smith is saying, who did this post-colonial memory book, she writes, silencing is not an absence of memory, but an active avoidance of it. So here we can say that the Italians, the silence of the Italians can be seen as a consequence of emotional trauma and incompatible memories with the dominant one. And I can say that silence, it can be perceived as the foundation of collective identity of the remained Italians. And this is the silence of the, some researchers say, as Bellinger and Bosson, excluded from history. So the silence of all the ones who are excluded from history, in this case here, it's the remained Italians, but also the migrants and the newcomers, because the fact of this change of population in Istria was never really admitted by the Slovenian or Yugoslavian state, we can say. So with these different discourses, we have a political instrumentalization of selective pasts. Who is the victim, who is the perpetrator, what to remember, what to forget on the national and regional level. And we have this competitive victimhood on the national level that it can be perceived in the national holidays. The Italians have the holiday of the National Day of Memory on Exodus and Foibe, where they omit these 20 years of fascism, and they are with this myth of the Italiani brava gente, while the Slovenians have the holiday called Day of the Return of Littoral Region to the motherland, where also this exodus is totally omitted. We had some reconciliation. The presidents tried to make some reconciliations, on the National Lieu de Mémoire. The last one happened even last year. And Slovenian Italian Historical Commission was made, but it seems it doesn't have a big effect. So we are here dealing with dissonant heritage in political discourses. As the researchers of the population transfer say, that countries that have carried out population transfers have silenced their presence and rewritten the history, while migrants refuse to forget as means of political power. Here it means, they mean the Germans also, but also it happened similarly to Italians. While till 90s, the discourse of the migrants of the Esuli was silenced, in the time of Berlusconi era, it became the national discourse. And even a way of showing the political power, because Italia conditioned with the Esuli property the entrance of Slovenia to European Union. So in Slovenia, we don't have any wider knowledge about this population change in Istria. And we have even this, maybe Neža will mention, the conflict about the stolen artworks from Istrian cities. They were taken during the World War II or before. Yeah. And like they are Italian or Venetian, let's say. And here the question is, do these artworks belong to the place or to the people? But still, we have a minority of these people here still. So the main discourse in the Slovenian research is that this exodus, they are voluntary migrations. And in my book, in fact, I question this discourse about the voluntary migration. It's true that in the archives, we don't have no archival sources of intentional cleansing of the Italians. We have on one side, in some towns or in some periods, we see an encouragement of Italians to leave Istria, while on the other side, there are also places and times where Italians were restrained. And this is clearly seen also by the rejection of their applications. But a change is seen after 48 with the Inform Bureau conflict, where the Italians, the communist Italians in Istria voted for Stalin and not for Tito. And it seems that more from that period, there was an encouragement of the migration. According to memorial data, what I gathered, a strong encouragement was when this land was annexed to Yugoslavia. Here there was also this politics of Slovenian Italian brotherhood that some say that prevented the exodus, but still this politics is restrained only to a small number. It's mostly to workers, communists, worker and communists, let's say. So when we speak about voluntarity, here we are dealing also with collective criminalization of Italian as fascists. Due to war crimes and the fascist oppression, they were seen as fascists. I forgot to give some memory about that. Mostly people were telling me that they were treated as fascists. Then from the memories, it's clear that there were intimidations, and there was a strong fear of foibe. These are karstic chasm, where again there are different discourses between Italian and Yugoslavian side. According to Italian, just Italians were killed, and according to Yugoslavians, it's all the opponents of the communistic system. The problem also is the philosophy, Yugoslavian philosophy of false Italians. This would be the Italians with Slavic surnames that Yugoslavia would have to help them to regain the Slavic identity. And by putting these Italian children with Slavic surname to the Slovenian and Croatian schools. I have done some memories of this. What I noted is that the memories of the exiles, of the migrants, are frozen in fear. When you read the memories of them, there you can perceive a lot of fear. While when I did research into the memories of the remained Italians, I didn't perceive this fear, and it's clear that they have adapted to the new social environment, and the ones who migrated, let's say, were frozen in the maybe post-war situation. So here I have some memories of this, because many Italians were discriminated not only for not speaking Slavic language, Slovenian or Croatian, but also because their surnames were associated with Yugoslavian origins. So here I have a memory from somebody from Rovinj in Croatia. Like, my mother never learned Croatian. My father did, but my mother tried, went to courses, but never really picked it up. On the top of that, she had a Croatian last name, ending with ich. So nobody ever spoke her in Italian, only in Croatian. We used to have these long family talks about how we were looked upon, about how in the shops, in the post office, or at the water supply company, the people were offensive, or didn't want to serve you, or ignored you, didn't see you, made you feel invisible. So, according to this Yugoslavian politics, these were these false Italians who have to be helped, even against their will, to regain the Slavic identity. And this happened with putting them in the Slovenian and Croatian school, which were abolished between the time of fascism. So many Italian-speaking children with Slavic surnames were involuntarily transferred to newly established Slovenian and Croatian schools, and they didn't know a word of Slovenian and Croatian, as it happened during the era of fascism, when the Slovenian and Croatian children were sent to Italian school. Like somebody said to me, there were around 28, 30 of us, and then out of the blue, only 10 of 11 of us came to school. Why? Because those with their last name ending in ich had to go to the Slovenian school, even though they didn't speak the language. So this is another, let's say, undirect pressure, we can say. So even the historians admit that Yugoslavian authorities were aware of the inappropriate attitudes toward Eastern Italians, of the removal of Italian signs, delays in reopening schools, unequal representation in committees, teachers who were not trusted, but nothing was really done. So what were all the reasons, apart of all this that I mentioned? There were also for exodus. There were severe economic conditions, then socialist coercive measures against the richer part of the population. The richer part was usually Italian. So confiscation of private property, prohibition of traveling trade, distribution of expropriated land, constitution of workers' cooperatives. There was this strong language shift. What if the Italian was before the language in Istria? Now the Yugoslavia wanted bilingualism in Slovenian and Croatian, Slovenian here. There was also a strong Italian anti-Yugoslav propaganda, especially on the Italian radios. The problem was the closure of the borders and links with Trieste as the main regional economic center. And with this link, the economic reasons, maintaining the jobs in Trieste, artisan and merchant losing their assets. And a lot of people migrated also because they wanted to maintain links with the migrated families. Among the Italians, there was a strong feeling of becoming a foreigner, even if they remained at home. So because of the change in social political circumstances, loss of the social network, new dominant language, and negative perception of the Italians. From the memories, it's clear that Italians who didn't speak two languages, if they were employed by the state, they lost their jobs, and they were also socially, economically excluded. Some of the people, according to the memories, migrated also because they didn't accept the reversal of social power relations. Because from the dominant under the fascism, they became the subordinated. And according to what people told me, and it's true that more migrants came from the towns, mostly, as people explained to me, because they were not used to the co-ethnic cohabitation. In rural areas, more this co-ethnic cohabitation were, and there was not so much fear of the Slavs as in the urban areas. So here we speak about indirect pressures. So people felt intimidated, saw no future at home, as Philip there says, for other kind of population transfers. So according to historians, is the legal right to opt. But from the research of the individual experiences, you can see that in fact they were forced to take the voluntary decision to leave. So this voluntariness is questioned. Here there is also memory of some violent intimidation. Is from Ubak, also in Croatia. So it's about grandfather of somebody from today living in Isola, and it was in Croatia. So they came in the night, partisans or Yugoslavians. They turned up in the evening and said, if you find you here tomorrow morning, we will shoot your family. So my grandfather tied his things onto an ox and left. My grandpa was a landowner. He had vineyard, a house, everything. But they took it away from him. And in transit camp, in this refugee camp, he was devastated and heavy-hearted because he knew his fellow villagers made this to him. So here we can speak also about the violence that is taking place among the members of the same, let's say, village, nations, and community. And here probably also this kind of revenge against the richer class. And then the ones who stayed, why? I think they had the remained or the rimasti, even if they don't want to be called in this way. I think they had to have great courage to resist, to stay, to resist, because when 90% of people are going away, it's more difficult to decide to not to live, let's say. Why? According to their memories, they remain because of the attachment to place or to their home, or especially to the farms. They said that they were not involved in any ideological political system, neither in fascism, neither in communism. Mostly people remained from the rural areas where they were used to this co-ethnic cohabitation, and they had to learn the new language to go to the Slovenian and Croatian schools, so they had to adapt to this new environment. And who stayed were the anti-fascist and socialist families. I will show some memory. But them too, they were disappointed that the nationalism defeated the internationalist socialist idea. Concerning how the environment changed, here is an Italian memory who say, my mom wanted to leave. My dad, although he had some problems with the party, didn't want to leave. He never stopped believing that what was going on were only mistakes on the way to socialism, communism, and that everything would sooner or later fall into place, that there was no way nationalism could prevail. So this is not about the change of the environment, but this is these difficulties in the families where one of them was strongly with the socialist idea and decided to stay, also disappointed because the Yugoslavian nationalism won over the socialist idea. And as an Italian here from Koper told me, who stayed? Sorry for mistakes. Those hungry moms like my father who said, that here or there, why would I go there? What's more, my father was a communist. And who were communists? Poor devils who believed that under communism they would be better off, be like the rich. So it was predominantly the intellectuals who left, as people told me. Like the Italian told me, everyone was gone. Engineers, doctors, teachers, only those who couldn't afford to live and had no education remained. Some stayed also because of the catastrophic conditions in the refugee centers and the negative reception of the refugees in Italy, also perceived as fascist. And these shattered promises of a better life. So many of them, according to my informators, also made suicide. So there is one father of my informant who said, I'm not going there. I have my own house. The worst that can happen to me is that they kill me. To live a prisoner's life there, out of the question. That's why we stayed. Then we have cases when after this catastrophic conditions in the refugee camps, people returned back to Istria, and this happened with a fisherman in Koper, who after a week in a transit camp in Italy returned and taught farmers from a nearby village how to fish, because the knowledge was lost after Italians had left. So as 90% of the population of the Italians, especially of the urban area left, you can imagine that a lot of traditions were lost. And here we can see how a tradition was lost, but then, taught again to the local farmers about fishing. So Italians, even if they remained Italians, even if they didn't migrate it, they stayed at home, but at home they felt as foreigners. Due to the change of these social political circumstances, loss of social network, and new dominant language. Mostly, they told me they didn't know before Slovenian, and they had to learn it. They were collectively held responsible for war crimes and decades of violent fascist politics, and their memories and heritage silenced and neglected. Here we have, I mentioned already, the change of relations of power from dominant to subordinated, and the Italians holding socialist affiliations were bitterly disappointed by the Yugoslavian nationalism. About the change of the environment, an Italian said, we had rights, all of them, but my town has nevertheless changed. All the names were in Croatian, so it's from Rovin. Nothing in Italian, of course. I can't recall feeling a foreigner in my own country back then, but later, certainly. Here, when we speak about foreigners, is we have to say that foreigners does not mean only a link to geographic origin or territory, but can be related to community appartenance and someone's limited access to local resources. So the ability to access local resources depends or not on the belonging to the community. And here I heard many stories about Italian farmers narrated about the loss of their clients because the new inhabitants refused to buy their products as they didn't want to buy from the fascists. So here the foreigners is not geographical, physical, but it's from the exclusion of from the society. Still in Yugoslavia, in the Yugoslavian perception, there were a small part of good and honest Italians. So these were the anti-fascists, and the supporters of socialist system. But then they became suspect after this crisis of the Cominform in 48, when Italian communists in Zone B were massively opting against Tito's party for Stalin. They had to, and so these communists had to demonstrate their loyalty to Yugoslavia by participating in the political battle for the annexation to Yugoslavia. And here is the father of the director of a museum told me. He also wrote a book about this, so he is not really hidden then. My father was a communist Italian, and he was very grateful to Yugoslavia and had no anti-Yugoslav inclinations. Still, he was expected to participate in the cleansing, to go from door to door and talk Italians into leaving, so to persuade Italians into leaving the territory. So about migrations, emigrations and immigrations. First, let's say from 44 to 54, there were only sporadic migrations when this territory was still not annexed to Yugoslavia. But after 54, when the territory of Zone B was annexed to Yugoslavia, massive migrations, but really massive. And it's in these 2-3 years, till 57, that the Istrian towns were totally emptied. It means, I didn't hear say put this memory, but someone told me in 1 year he was the teacher he was teacher in the Italian school. In 1 year, there were 4 classes, and in the next year, he stayed with 3 pupils. Such the migration was in 1 year. So, according to memories, the first immigrants coming to this environment, that at that time was Italian environment, were bilingual. And they were mostly coming from the wider Primorska region. So from this region, borderland region, where people were all bilingual. And also a lot of Slovenians which escaped from the fascistic regime in this time came back. They were all them too used to live with the Italian culture. And because new schools, Slovenian, were established because they were abolished under fascism, so there was a big need of teachers, bilingual teachers. While after 54, the migrations became massive migration, as I told you before. So because most of the Italians left this territory because they realized that it will not be part of Italy. So these towns were really emptying, and massive immigrations from all parts of Slovenia were performed. And from this period is the story that I heard when I started my research, but I couldn't believe. But then so many people told me about that it was confirmed, that when they came here in these 3 Eastern towns, they got from the municipality a bunch of keys in their hand, and they had just to choose the apartment, one of the emptied apartment of the tenants. But as Deja will probably then told, these apartments were not in good conditions. It's not like today when Istria is very touristic, but this apartment after 10 years of not knowing to which country will belong, and with no innovation, with no infrastructure. This is Neja research, so I will not speak, but just these apartments were in a very bad condition. So many people also decide not to stay and live back, let's say, to Slovenia. And people were talking about rats, that there was no water, fresh water, and this. because it was perceived as a Wild West, the authorities local were inviting people, giving them some privilege, the housing, the jobs, but it was in fact hard to maintain these people because the living conditions were not very nice. But this Neja will tell more. I will slowly finish. I did also longer chapters on the new social boundaries that were formed in these new populations, because these towns, the urban society was created totally from the beginning, with the remained Italians just 10%. Here is a bit difficult to speak because we have a lot of different people coming and living in this town. So we have the remained Italians, then we have the immigrated Italians from Croatia that were perceived differently than the immigrated Italians from Italy. Then we have Italians from inter-ethnic families. We have the immigrants from local environment, from Slovenian Croatia, living with Italians before. So also these returnees from the fascist violence. And we have immigrants from continental Slovenia and from all the republics of ex-Yugoslavia. What it's clear is that, as I showed you in the beginning, there was a strong symbolic boundary between, let's say, Italian urban people and rural Slovenian or Croatian. And this was a symbolic boundary that was based on the ethnic elements, mostly Italians against the Slavs. But this symbolic boundary seems to, according to the analysis of memory that I did, seems to have changed after it. And the main divide in this new socialist community was on the basis of primacy of living in the place. So Italians and the first Slovenian immigrants felt like the primacy against all the later immigrants, all the other massive immigrants from Slovenia, and against all the Balkan others with the orientalizing discourse. So the division was not based anymore on the ethnic element, but on the primacy of the living in this place. So there are many symbolic boundaries, and I will not go deep into that. So we have the Italian Istrians, again, all the newcomers or other Italians and Slovenians against the newcomers from former Yugoslavian Republic. They are perceived as non-Istrians of the Balkan type in a clearer orientalizing discourse. As a Slovene told me, one of the first who came to this environment in a still Italian environment, he said me, a different culture breaks in. There were fewer differences, much fewer between us, Slovenians and Italians, who actually lived in the same territory. But then a completely different culture strikes. They were picking people there in villages, they were herdsmen. You brought people, sheep herds more or less, and you put them in a highly developed urban environment. So this is this perception of the orientalizing other. I did also the research of who is feeling at home now in this new environment. Italians, I said, at home, but they feel foreigners. The first Slovenians from the regions, they felt as at home because they were used to this Italian environment, and they're now taking roots in this new environment. I heard some stories about these people, especially children, discovering porcelain in their houses, like discovering the silence alternative past in this hegemonic socialist new version of the past, where the Italianness of these cities was omitted. And then we have the settlers from ex-Yugoslavia, who declared themselves to be foreigners on their own. Their links there to two homes, one here and the other. By Slovenians, they're perceived as others, but when I spoke with them, I realized that mostly of them, they don't feel so much as others as they as we, the Slovenians, perceive them. About place attachment and heritage, if we think of the majority of population today in Istria towns that are immigrants, we can detect a lack of any transgenerational memories linked to their new home environment, and they are in the processes still of taking root. With the new generation, I think it will be easier. So, as a Slovenian told me, that's what we miss here when we stayed. The connection, the stories, knowing what happened here in this house, for example, who lived here. These ties have been broken when the majority left. That's why we don't have any attitude, let's say, towards certain buildings. If it was about our ancestors, it would be different. And about heritage, the Italian nostalgic memories and identity is anchored in historic Venetian urban environment, and they feel wounded by architectural interventions and the heritage decay. Heritage decay can be linked to the process of non-heritageization, which is a logic of making invisible, denying the memories of those who identify with this heritage. As an Italian told me about one Venetian palace in Capodistria, it has been in reconstruction for so long, but it's always closed, abandoned. They don't take care of it. The same goes for many things in Capodistria. They don't have this sentiment. It means the immigrants. So they have no sensibility for the local, and they bring things from other environments. And in this memory, we can clearly detect these social boundaries with the newcomers. No, I think also Neja will speak about this. So in these competing heritage discourses, Italians' memories and heritages are perceived as alternative and marginal heritage discourse. And we can say that heritage is as a scream of the silence of the Italian memories and evidence of primacy, of legitimacy. Because in the last year, the Italians proclaimed old cemeteries with the Italian tombs, families for cultural heritage to show their primacy in these towns. And also their dialect was registered into intangible heritage of Slovenia. So I will finish in 1 minute too. Here we have a lot of questions of discontinuities, reinventions, appropriations of tradition, heritage as an element of Slovenization of Istria, and heritage as divisive or cohesive social element. If you would look here down, but now you have the curtain, you would see this picture where you can see this abandonment of pre-war urban heritage, which probably is due to the lack of identification of the majority of population with their living environment. Most of the inhabitants of the town centers are descendants of the economically deprived Yugoslavian working class, which was especially marginalized after the independence of Slovenia. So this is my last diapositive. So here we have difficult and undigested past. Unpeaceable memory still haunts the present. And here the question is how to live together with these negative legacies from the past, with the fascism, with the exodus, with the socialism. How to live together with our dead and the living, would Derrida say. Assmann would answer that we have to confront ourselves with our own memories and listen with empathy to others. This book is trying to do. So the book is trying to give voice to the silence, which are not accepted neither from the one, neither from the other national memory. the ones who stayed, the ones who came, and the ones who left also. So let's say, let the silence speak. Thank you for your attention.